Welcome to the webinar on evaluation criteria for object storage. Before we begin, I want to get some housekeeping items out of the way. So if you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the GoToWebinar control panel. We may be able to get to your questions while we're presenting, but most likely we'll get to them at the end during the Q&A section or during the Q&A session. If we don't get to your question, we will definitely follow up with you directly. Sometimes people ask questions that aren't really relevant to the entire group, but rest assured that we will get to you. And with that, let's jump right into the presentation. So here is the intro slide. I am the VP of Marketing for Caringo, Adrian Herrera. I'm responsible for all internal and or all inbound and outbound marketing. Prior to Caringo, I was on the founding team of one of the first enterprise cloud storage services. So I bring knowledge from both the software and services aspect of object storage. With me, I have John Bell, one of our highly skilled technical alliance managers. John, do you want to give a little more info on your background?
Certainly. So I've been with Caringo as a technical account manager for 3 years, assisting with both pre and post-sales activity and heavily involved in the deployment of Caringo's object storage solutions in the field over those years. Prior to that, I was an information security officer for an online SaaS business, and prior to that, I've had much experience in system network and storage architecture.
All right, thanks, John. So let's go over the goal of this webinar. So the goal is really to provide an overview of the information needed for a successful object storage evaluation. I want to make it clear that this isn't going to be a Caringo ad. In fact, there'll be very little information on our actual feature set. We're not going to cover the features to look for. This material really assumes that you've already done some research, you're aware of the vendors. What we wanted to do is provide you with a framework of questions to ask any object storage vendor from an integration and deployment perspective. And the reason for that is, object storage is more than storage. What we're finding when we talk to a lot of people is that there's still a lot of confusion in object storage and how to properly evaluate it. And that's for a lot of different reasons. Mostly, object storage really is a paradigm shift. It's a lot of times, most of the times, it's software defined. So you need to evaluate it a little differently than, say, your traditional storage array. Object storage is more about the data versus the application. So traditionally, you have an application, the application needs from a storage perspective, from an IOPS perspective. That's not really the way to look at object storage. You need to look at throughput, you need to look at concurrent users, you need to look at integration, and you really need to look many years down the road. Also, object storage includes protection. So you basically eliminate RAID. You don't need to use RAID if you use object storage. And a lot of object storage solutions include data lifecycle management. And because it's this paradigm shift, there's a lot of vendor FUD in the market. So you hear terms like storage software, software defined. There's some organizations that are just basically using management layers to virtualize legacy devices, legacy storage arrays that really don't solve the problem. So there's a lot of vendor FUD, and what we are finding is it's confusing the customer base, it's confusing the market. We hope to at least enable you with the right questions to ask to get through some of that FUD. Object storage is also web scale. You connect to it through a RESTful interface. All object storage solutions have a RESTful interface, whether they have a file system interface on top of that, below that file system interface, they're writing to their proprietary API, and most have also integrated the Amazon S3 API. In object storage solutions, automation trumps structure. So what we mean by that is The days of going to a specific server and saying, my piece of content, my file is on that server, is on that drive, are really going away. But what you get in return is high automation, and that's the only way to really get to massive scales, petabyte scales and beyond. And object storage is really about more about service than infrastructure. So you're not taking hardware and divvying it up and creating LUNs and deploying those, giving LUN access to specific applications. You're really moving to more of a services oriented approach, and because of that, there's this continued evolution. It's not this progressive step of buying hardware every 3, 5, or 7 years. You're continuously evolving both applications and hardware underneath the software. That's a benefit that object storage gives you. And there's a lot of options. So you have your choice of going with a fully packaged software solution. You have your choice of going with an appliance. You have your choice of going with open source. You can integrate directly to a vendor's API. You can choose one of the many gateways out there. A lot of ISVs have also integrated access to a lot of the major vendors directly into their applications. And object storage is good for most corporate data these days. So unstructured information is really what object storage is good for. Your documents, your photos, your videos, and that's the majority of enterprise data these days. So John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I would point out that another thing that's very important, especially related to the model shift and the web scale aspects of these type of storage solutions, is the metadata aspect of object storage. Not so much being able to have a big pile of stuff moved from traditional storage and being able to put it into object storage, but being able to provide context to that large pile of unstructured data that your organization generates over time. And through a solid metadata approach, being able to turn that into actionable business intelligence.
Yeah, thank you. So you pull all that together, and what you have is really a solution that requires a new way of thinking internally. Object is one of the technologies that's really helping to establish or move forward the concept of software-defined data center. And you really need to start thinking about your vendors more like partners that will help you continually evolve. So the framework for a successful evaluation, and this isn't an exhaustive list. We just really want to focus on the high level character, or the high level segments that you really need to focus on when talking to object storage vendors. So the ideal evaluation team, guidelines for workload and use cases, integration and access requirements, network and authentication authorization requirements, and deployment options. So all of these segments or these sections we'll go over in detail, and we'll equip you with the right questions to ask. So let's start with the ideal evaluation team. Now, in small organizations, this can be just 1 or 2 people with all these skill sets. In larger organizations, it can be a larger team. But from a baseline skill set, on your object storage evaluation team, you should really have a storage administrator. You should have a network administrator, someone who knows not only about your existing network configuration, but that can also make modifications if needed. And then we can't stress the last one enough. You really need to involve the business stakeholders right from the start. So, and that's everyone that is going to be touching or using the object storage system. And you could get requirements from each one of these stakeholders, whether they're end users, whether it's your security department, whether it's legal, and make sure you have a complete 360-degree view of the entire data lifecycle from creation to expiration. And that's important because a lot of the times you need to set these policies when you first store a piece of content. And supplemental skills needed. So these are based on the approach. If you go with an open source solution, you will need to have developers on staff, and you really need to have a commitment to the DevOps process. You should really be involved in the community. Some other object storage solutions rely on a database. So if you go with one of those, you will need a DBA on staff, and you need to make sure that they're up to speed on the database used for that specific solution. So John, did you want to add any additional color to the team and skills needed?
I would add that in addition, if you're doing open source, even if you don't do open source, you may find DevOps resources highly desirable to have, especially if you decide to go with the approach of doing native integration with the object storage solution. You're going to be working with a vendor's SDK in those type of scenarios. Uh, Most likely you're going to be developing some kind of glue logic to support your business's processes and workflows, and a DevOps person or team can come in very handy in those type of situations.
That's good information. So we'll jump right into the workload and use cases. Again, this isn't an exhaustive list. These are questions that are great to ask the business stakeholders and others, and then you can compare their responses and really come up with real concrete and solid ranges that you can share with your vendor to help them properly configure your test environment, properly configure your production environment. So questions like, what problems are you trying to solve? It's an open-ended question by design. That way you get into a conversation with the end users, with all the stakeholders. What are the performance requirements? So traditionally in the storage world, you talk about speeds and feeds, you're talking about IOPS. In the object storage world, you really need to start talking about throughput. You need to start talking about concurrent users because you directly access it. So there is a different conversation you have to have there. Capacity requirements, this isn't only just about the total amount of storage, it's also about the number of files, the number of objects you're going to store, and the variability in those sizes. So there's a lot of solutions out there that are pretty rigid as far as storing specific file sizes. For instance, you need to set up a cluster for small files, you need to set up a cluster for large files. So make sure you get to the bottom of the variability in file sizes that you require, and that the vendor you select has the right flexibility in their architecture to support that. As far as anticipated growth rate, it's good to know just so you can plan accordingly. Are you replacing an existing application or creating a new one? This will help you determine the correct integration method. If you're replacing an existing application, chances are you'll want to use some sort of file system gateway or one of the gateway vendors out there. If you're creating a new one, the best way, the most efficient way, most optimal way is always to write to a vendor's proprietary API. That's always going to give you the best performance and the most flexibility from a feature set and functional perspective. Even if you go with an existing application, think 5 years out, think a decade out, about eventually integrating to a vendor's API, because that's really where you get the most benefit from object storage. Can you define the lifecycle of the data you want to store? Again, define it from creation all the way to expiration. Define the value, because a lot of the times you will be able to change the protection method based upon time, based upon access, based upon age, and you'll be able to save a considerable amount on your operation. So you'll be able to move from, let's say, 3 replications down to a more efficient, from a footprint perspective, erasure coding protection scheme. And again, we're not going to go into those protection schemes today. I'll point you to some references at the end of the presentation, but you really need to have a good understanding of the life cycle and the value of the data you want to store. And then, can you define the SLA? of the data you want to store. And when we say SLA, we're talking about the availability from a nines perspective. So, obviously the more amount of nines you have, the more resources that data is going to take from either from a footprint perspective or from an overall processing perspective when you go to access that information. And then one of the key qualifiers that everyone should be asking when evaluating object storage solutions, it'll actually help you identify all of the use cases within your organization that aren't good for object storage. Will you be storing highly transactional data or working with a relational database management solution? So anytime data frequently changes, or you have a high transaction use case, that's really not a good solution for object storage. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. If you have a situation where the data you're managing is going to be accessed by applications that do the typical, I have a pointer, a file pointer walking through a file and looking at individual pieces and blocks, that's not going to be a strength for your typical object storage solution. Block is not going away. Block certainly solves those type of problems, and that is a great place to leverage those technologies. For object, not so much. The other point I would add here regarding existing applications or creating new ones, whether or not you decide to leverage a vendor's RESTful API or not, one approach that we see quite a bit in the field is customers and integrators standardizing on something that is basically a de facto standard, Amazon S3 API. So one thing you might want to consider when you're looking at various object storage vendor solutions is how good, how solid is their support of the Amazon S3 API. A typical use case that we see is that a customer has developed a suite of applications to use the Amazon service. And what they find out over time is that the cost has increased for them greatly because they have entities within the business that are accessing that data frequently in the cloud. They're getting a lot of chargeback for bandwidth usage from Amazon, and they may decide that they want to bring a lot of that back in-house to avoid incurring those charges. The issue is that they don't want to have to go back and refactor all the applications, the client applications that they built against Amazon S3. So you would want to consider how good that implementation is for a particular vendor that you're evaluating for creating these public object storage, or I'm sorry, private object storage clouds.
So in your experience, John, how long does it take to ask these questions and get appropriate responses from key stakeholders? It ranges, I know it varies, but what have you seen?
Usually what I would consider to be RFP type of activity or RFI type of activity usually can be turned around fairly quickly. Most people will have a canned set of questions that they ask when they first engage to gather these type of requirements. It's not a very large list typically. You would see emphasis on things such as, what is the average size of the type of object you're trying to store? How frequently is it accessed? What kind of applications use it, to flesh out whether or not it's transactional data versus, your typical piece of unstructured data that is written once and maybe read infrequently, things of that nature. And most vendors that have a lot of deployments in the field and have a lot of scars of knowledge, I guess you would call it, from dealing with different use cases are going to have a very good questionnaire in that regard.
Good. So as far as integration and access requirements, so the main question to ask is the access protocol RESTful or NAS-based storage protocol based? So from a RESTful perspective, you heard John talk about proprietary vendor API and also the S3 API. There's a lot of sub questions that you can ask there. I think John covered a lot of those in the previous slide. And do you have internal developers? Do you have the skill sets in order to write to the RESTful API? As mentioned previously, most vendors give yeah, SDKs or have SDKs for the major languages out there. From the storage protocol or NAS perspective, you really need to ask a lot of questions about how data is being accessed. Is usage heavily oriented around block level file modifications? If so, maybe object storage isn't the way to go. Maybe a filer is still the way to go. Is workload predictable, and can that expected usage be profiled? Can the application be ported to HTTP in the future? That's a strong recommendation. Ultimately, you do want to cut the cord. You don't want to be caught flat-footed. You don't want to try to solve today's storage problems with yesterday's technology. So ultimately, you are going to need to make that cut over to a RESTful API. And lastly, are there third-party software packages required for integration? If so, it's good to get all the vendors talking to each other and make sure that everything that you use functions properly, that everything works together. John, do you have anything to add to either of those?
Yeah, definitely nailing down the use cases with the stakeholders is going to be key when you're evaluating what the access requirements and how the integration can best work. And the one thing that I would keep in mind here more than anything else is that, especially if this is a greenfield deployment, uh, being able to give a message to the stakeholders that this is your opportunity with object storage technology to move away from some of the limitations that were encountered in previous storage deployments with traditional storage protocols or traditional block storage. And one of the key things that are brought to the table by an object storage solution is the ability to have metadata tagged with these pieces of unstructured data that you're going to be storing. Again, bringing that context to that large set of unstructured data that an organization generates. And the reason that that's important is because if you just treat object storage as an opportunity to take this big pile of stuff off of your SAN or your NAS and put this big pile of stuff over here, you're still just, you still just move the problem from one location to the other. But if you associate metadata that's important to you, characteristics that are important to you about that data, when you instantiate that data into the object storage cluster, you can go back 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later and query on the characteristics of that data and bring back a result set very quickly. A great use case for this is video archive for police. A lot of the municipality customers that we have, such as City of Austin, use storage in this fashion. They tag the videos with metadata characteristics about those videos that are important to them. Which squad car was that video taken from? Which officer was on duty? Date, time. Any other tags that they can put in there. A custom metadata actually that's important to them. And then they can go back at a much later date if they get a subpoena saying I need to have videos for this officer from these locations on such and such a date. If you have a very strong approach to your metadata format beforehand, it's very easy to go back and query on that and get a result set quickly and turn that request around. And you have to think in terms of, oh, I'm not searching through a few 100,000 objects or even 1,000,000 objects. I'm searching through 1 billion objects, 10 billion objects. That's when the problem becomes really difficult for traditional storage solutions. And this is where object storage and metadata handling truly shines.
Yeah, and that's an excellent use case, the City of Austin use case. For those of you interested, we do have a full use case write-up on our website. As far as network and authentication and authorization requirements, I think I'll let you take this one, John. I think it's a little more technical.
Certainly, I can dive right into this. When you're dealing with your typical object storage solution, it is going to be a clustered solution, pretty much by default. So as such, it's going to have some level of networking requirements. In our case, we have a requirement around TCP/IP networking. Um, typically we're going to recommend that even though it is, just straight TCP/IP, you're going to want to have a dedicated storage VLAN so that the storage cluster communications are segmented away from the rest of normal business activity. That's a typical recommendation that we would make. That gives you the flexibility to tune that particular segment specifically for the type of activity that the cluster is going to be doing. Other questions that you may want to ask a vendor would be related to integration to authentication and authorization mechanisms that may already exist within an organization. Do you need to have support for multi-tenancy because you plan to store the data for multiple business units or even multiple companies under an umbrella within this storage solution? Do each of those tenants have specific quotas or service level agreements associated with the type of data that they're going to be storing in the object store solution? Do you need to integrate authentication with LDAP or Active Directory stores that are already in place? Do you plan to use HTTP token-based authentication? We see that a lot for people that want to build mobile applications, for example. They'd like to do HTTP token off if they can. Just one of the many set of questions you can ask related to how am I going to integrate the storage into this existing infrastructure and leverage, especially in the case of off and off, those type of stores that are already in place.
Great. And from a deployment option perspective, the question you should ask is really who should size your solution when storage is software. So when it's software-based, when it's software-defined, who should really size your solution from an infrastructure, from a hardware perspective? So we think it should be the software vendor in conjunction with you, of course. And a few questions to ask from a dedicated hardware perspective. Do you have enough hardware to properly test a solution? Have you properly tuned your hardware for your use case? So you can use performance papers that vendors have as guidelines, but at the end of the day, you really need to test the solution within your environment. A lot of the times the performance papers, they're meant to show the optimum performance in a scenario that is more theoretical than practical. So just make sure that you have, that you're able to collect that practical information based upon your network, your architecture, your use case. From a VM perspective, this is the optimal way to run this is on dedicated hardware. You can run a lot of storage solutions on VMs. If you do, if you start your tests on a VM and you're ultimately going to go to bare metal or install on bare metal, you make sure that you can extrapolate VM performance. If you are deploying on a VM, make sure that your storage nodes, the actual nodes that have the data, are locked down, that those don't change. John, you have a lot of experience in the VM world. Do you have anything to add to either one of those?
Just in the deployment world in particular, and this could be either for VMs or for dedicated hardware, this is one of those areas where your conversations with the stakeholders are going to be key for two reasons. First and foremost, they're going to have a set storage footprint that they're going to need to deploy initially to move data from one location into the object storage solution. You may run into conversations or concepts related to raw versus usable storage when you start talking about that. And the reason when you're dealing with software-defined storage like this and raw versus usable is that there are different ways for providing data durability protection within an object storage solution. You will see some solutions that will just do straight copies or what we call replication to protect the data and the associated overhead that goes with that. You may say other vendors that use what we call erasure coding, where if you're used to working with RAID, you actually work with erasure coding on a daily basis. You just don't hear it called that. It's just that most object storage vendors are going to be much more flexible in what type of ratio they have between data and parity when they're deploying the object storage solution versus your traditional RAID. So that's going to have an impact on the eventual hardware footprint that gets deployed, the raw versus usable storage. What's associated with that, and this is another area where conversations with the stakeholders is key, is the type of failure modes that they're going to be able to tolerate while executing the business process that they're interested in. If you have a situation where they need to have uh, full access to data where one of two sites is completely down, that's going to have an impact on the amount of hardware you're going to need to support this solution. Maybe they just need to support one or two drives dying. Well, maybe at that point their requirements aren't nearly as strict. But those are the type of questions that you should be asking the stakeholders is, what type of footprint do you need? What type of failure modes do you need us to support? What type of availability do you need to have for this data within this object storage solution? And what you'll get from those very simple set of questions and answers is a set of derived requirements that go with that will eventually give you an idea of what the hardware footprint is going to look like.
That's good information. And we wanted to, as I mentioned in the opening, we wanted to keep this very targeted and very focused on helping you ask the right questions. If you do want more of a feature matrix, we do have a webinar on our website. Just go to the resources section. It's a 20-minute webinar on how to evaluate object storage. We go more into a feature and function matrix there. From a requirements and test plan perspective, you heard both John and I say this many times throughout the presentation. Talking to the stakeholders is key. Getting their input is key. Being able to define the life cycle of content or your information, your data from creation to expiration is key. And bring your vendor into the discussions. They can help you. Obviously, we Caringo are held here to help you. We have, the conversation should start with your account executive. We have a number of excellent sales engineers on staff backing the sales engineers up. We have our great technical alliance team, which John is part of, and we also have a solutions team. So, from our perspective, we are here to help you. We're here to help you develop the questions, develop the test plan. Just reach out to your account executive, and we can get that conversation started. So in closing, I just wanted to give you one very light slide on who we are. We were founded in 2005 to build software-defined storage, so we have always provided storage software. I won't read all those bullets, but the last one is really one to focus on. We've had clusters running without issues for over 4 years. So our guys know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about, and we've been able to architect very reliable solutions for customers in the field. We have hundreds of customers. We have many ISVs who've integrated directly to our API, and we're a recognized leader in the space. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Let me see if there are any. So go ahead and type in your questions in the dialog box if you have any, and I will make sure that it goes to the correct person, either John or myself. So we do have a few questions coming in. And okay, John, this one's for you. And it's about timeline again. So how long is a timeline to go from developing the questions to executing the test plan to deployment? What should you expect?
From an end-to-end perspective, like say from initial engagement to say POC, would that be a reasonable time frame, proof of concept?
Yeah, they didn't specify, but do both POC and deployment.
Yeah, POC and deployment. Well, since deployments usually can come pretty quickly after purchase, once the POC is done and there's acceptance, the time frame on that is basically up to when the customer is going to purchase all the necessary pieces. Usually, from first engagement to POC to where a decision is made, we've seen time frames that range to from as short as a couple of months, which in the case of Verizon, it happened to be was a couple of months, and that was even with a competitive evaluation. They made a decision very quickly to as long as a year. A lot of it tends to be driven by how quickly an organization can bring resources to bear from a stakeholder and an IT perspective to put focus into the evaluation. Typically, they run anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending.
Okay. We have another question. It said you mentioned running in a VM environment. What would be guidelines for when to choose running object storage node images in a VM versus running on bare metal?
I would make sure if when running VM that you're either going to be using that for an object store. Um, that's mostly for evaluation purposes, functional verification as part of the POC process. When you start getting into performance evaluation, that's when you need over and you start needing to consider standing up dedicated equipment for the object store. Um, it's going to shine in those type of situations. You may be loading it up with a very large data set, for example. That very large data set is going to have an impact on how much CPU and memory and physical disk volume you need to run the tests. Um, there's a lot of emphasis on what you need for testing from a cluster perspective, but what we found in practice is that a lot of people are limited by the amount of client resources that they can bring to bear for this kind of testing. I had one situation where we were doing a performance test for a very large online firm, and I ran out of client horsepower before the cluster was fully exercised. And you can run into situations like that. These object stores are designed to be highly scalable and utilize their resources to best effect for web scale. And people don't consider the client side of the equation when they're doing the evaluations.
Yeah, that's good. Good feedback. Um, so there was a response that said good answer, and it would seem to me that running object store on bare metal is a way to go in production environment. VM for test upgrade or functional test, but not production. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, I would say that's the correct assessment. You would use VMs for functional verification. It's great for your developers in the case of the DevOps team where they're doing native integration and they want to make sure that the code that they're writing is functionally correct. And then what you would do to tune that for scale is you turn around and you deploy the object store on what amounts to bare metal. And you would take advantage of having those dedicated resources. We've seen some customers that are sophisticated enough with their virtual machine environments, especially the VMware customers, where they're able to set up necessary resource pools for virtual cluster machines, and they're able to make sure that things are scheduled within the host so that those object store cluster machines are guaranteed pretty much to have the resources that they need to do the type of work that they're being asked to do. Again, that goes back to including your IT team as part of the evaluation team, how sophisticated they are, in making sure that those type of things can happen, so that you're absolutely certain that the type of results that you're seeing are going to be well reflected for production.
Great. And we do have a few other questions that we'll follow up with directly. They're not completely relevant to this discussion. But I just want to thank everyone for their time today. I also want to thank John. As mentioned before, John is just one member of our technical alliances team. We have support staff around the world that can help you develop these questions, help you work with the stakeholders in your organization, answer these questions, and help you have a very successful evaluation of an object storage solution, and also help you with the ongoing evolution of your storage and infrastructure and really your data access for the long term. Uh, John, thanks for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, thank you, everyone. You see our contact information there if you want to follow up with either of us directly. Thank you.